The town was quiet that winter evening, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence. Snow had fallen in soft layers across the streets, muting the sounds of life that usually lingered even after sunset. The street lamps glowed weakly, throwing pale yellow halos onto the frozen ground. Inside a small, weather-worn house at the edge of town, a woman named Margaret sat by her window, staring out as though waiting for someone who would never come. Margaret was a widow. Her husband, Richard, had passed away 3 years ago, and with his departure, it seemed as if life had slipped away from her too. The house felt bigger now, emptier, echoing with memories she didn't always want to remember. She had no children, no family close by, and though neighbors waved kindly, the warmth never really reached her heart. Nights were the worst. The silence pressed on her chest, and the loneliness crept in like a shadow she couldn't escape. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Margaret heard something unusual, a faint knock. Not strong, not demanding, just a soft tapping against her front door. She frowned, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and shuffled slowly to the door. At this hour, in this weather, it was rare for anyone to visit. When she opened it, the cold air rushed in, and standing there was a man, unkempt, shivering, and with eyes that told a story of battles long lost. He looked no older than 40, though hardship had carved deeper lines into his face. His clothes were torn and damp from the snow, his shoes worn thin. He didn't meet her gaze directly. Instead, he looked past her shoulder into the dim light of her home as though afraid of what her answer might be. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. I just need a place to warm up for a while." Margaret's instinct warred with her fear. She was a woman alone, and this was a stranger. Yet something in his voice, broken, pleading, so utterly human, made her pause. She stepped aside slowly and gestured for him to come in. The man entered, shoulders hunched, almost ashamed to take up space. He stood by the doorway, dripping melted snow onto the rug. Margaret closed the door firmly behind him. "What's your name?" she asked gently, though her heart raced. "Daniel," he replied after a pause. His eyes flickered up at her before darting away again. "But it doesn't matter. I'm not worth saving." The words cut through the room like a blade. Margaret froze, staring at him, her breath caught in her throat. Not worth saving. She had heard that phrase before, in different forms, in Richard's last days. Her husband, battling an illness he couldn't conquer, had whispered something similar. "Don't waste your strength on me, Maggie. I'm not worth it anymore." She had fought him on it then, clinging to hope, to love, to the life they shared. And now, years later, here was a stranger speaking the same despair. Margaret swallowed the lump rising in her throat and motioned for Daniel to sit near the fireplace. He hesitated, but the pull of warmth was too strong, and he sank onto the old armchair. His hands shook as he held them near the fire, and Margaret noticed how thin he was, how hunger seemed to cling to his frame as tightly as the tattered coat around him. "You look like you haven't eaten in days," she said softly. Without waiting for his answer, she went into the kitchen, her joints aching as she moved, and returned with a bowl of soup she had made earlier. She set it in front of him. Daniel stared at the bowl, his eyes glistening. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could hurt you. I could take what little you have." Margaret held his gaze then, her widow's eyes steady and firm. "Because you knocked on my door instead of breaking it, because you asked instead of taking. And because once, long ago, I learned that kindness is never wasted, even if it feels like it is." Daniel picked up the spoon with trembling hands, and for a long time, the only sound in the room was the quiet clinking of metal against the bowl. Margaret watched him, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, steady presence. When he finally finished, tears rolled silently down his face. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "You don't understand, the things I've done. The people I've hurt. I walked away from everything good in my life. I lost my family because I chose alcohol, drugs, the streets, and when I finally tried to fix it, it was too late. They didn't want me anymore. They were right. I'm not worth saving." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She reached for her husband's old blanket, still folded on the couch, and draped it over Daniel's shoulders. "You know," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "my husband used to think the same thing. He thought he was a burden when he was sick. He believed his life had lost value because he couldn't give any more, only take. But he was wrong. He was worth every sleepless night, every tear, every ounce of love I had to give. Because worth isn't about what you can do, it's about who you are, and the fact that you're here, breathing, still capable of choosing tomorrow. That makes you worth saving, Daniel." For the first time, Daniel looked at her fully. His eyes, once dim, seemed to hold a flicker of light, fragile but real. The night stretched on as they spoke. Daniel shared stories of his past, of regrets that weighed on him like chains, of the voices in his head that told him to give up. Margaret listened, not judging, not interrupting, simply offering the gift of being heard. She shared her own loneliness, the hollow ache of losing her husband, and how she had nearly let the silence swallow her whole. In that moment, two broken souls sat together, finding something resembling peace in the company of one another. Hours later, when Daniel finally drifted into a restless sleep on the couch, Margaret sat quietly, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. She thought about how many people in the world carried pain unseen, convinced they weren't worth saving. She realized then that maybe her purpose, in this chapter of her life, wasn't just to endure her loneliness, but to reach out to others lost in their own. When morning came, Daniel awoke with shame clouding his face, ready to leave, to vanish back into the streets. But Margaret stopped him at the door. "You don't have to go back to nothing," she said firmly. "There are shelters, programs, people who will help you rebuild, if you let them. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise you this, you are not alone." "Not anymore." Daniel's lips trembled. "Why would you do this for me?" Margaret smiled, though her eyes glistened with tears. "Because someone once told me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It multiplies, waiting for a place to go. Maybe mine was waiting for you." And in that moment, something shifted in Daniel. He wasn't magically healed, his scars weren't erased, and his burdens didn't vanish. But for the first time in years, he felt a hand reaching into the darkness to pull him toward light. Weeks later, Margaret watched from her window as Daniel walked toward the community center down the road, shoulders straighter than when he first appeared on her doorstep. He turned back once, just long enough to meet her gaze. His lips formed the words, "Thank you." Margaret's heart swelled. For the first time since Richard's passing, she didn't feel quite so alone. And as the snow began to melt, making way for spring, Margaret whispered into the quiet room, as if her husband could still hear her. "He thought he wasn't worth saving. But maybe saving him saved me, too." Closing message. Sometimes the people who believe they are beyond saving are the ones who need compassion the most. A single act of kindness, a moment of being seen, can shift the course of a life. We may never fully know the impact of our generosity, but somewhere, in someone's darkest hour, it can mean everything.